Welcome to another episode of the EcoCiv podcast. I'm Andrew Schwartz, co-founder and vice president of EcoCiv, and I'm honored to be joined today by Bridget Mugambe. Bridget's a social scientist with over 15 years work experience with NGOs in management, strategic planning, budgeting, fundraising, gender mainstreaming. She's an expert in policy analysis, which I hope we'll get to talk about today. She's an expert in advocacy, capacity building, and the generation and dissemination of information on food sovereignty, which is our main theme for this conversation. She serves as program coordinator for AFSA, the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, and which is an alliance of around 40 member networks active in over 50 countries with, I believe, an estimated member outreach of over 200 million people, which is absolutely incredible. That impact is exciting to me. So Bridget oversees a variety of programming covering policy advocacy on seed sovereignty, community land rights, climate justice, and consumer action. So this, complex interplay of social and environmental needs and issues. And today we'll be talking about agroecology as an alternative paradigm that can feed Africa while promoting the long-term well-being of people on the planet. So Bridget, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Andrew, for having me today.
Yeah, our pleasure. So let's just dive right in. Much of your work, as I just suggested, involves promoting this notion of this practice, this frame, this perspective of agroecology. Now, on the AFSA website, it's described as the antithesis of industrial, corporate-driven, monoculture-based agriculture systems. So before we get into explaining what agroecology is, I'm just wondering if you could shed light on the problem that AFSA sees, that you see with the industrial corporate-driven model of farming, and how agroecology is different.
Yes, Andrew, I think that's a good starting point, because the coming together of AFSA, like you mentioned, AFSA is an alliance of many organizations, many networks across the continent, covering up to 50 countries. And the coming together of AFSA, one of the critical issues that drove us to come together is the realization of the path that African agriculture seems to be taking. And of course, which is mainly focused on industrial agriculture. And of course, when you hear industrialization, everyone thinks of development. It's not a bad idea. But when you look at it in the perspective of agriculture and the kind of agriculture that we are proposing as industrial agriculture, then you see where the dangers are for Africa. So what we are seeing developing now in Africa is, one, there is a more focus on increasing production. So we are losing the other aspects of food beyond quantities. We are looking at producing more maize, producing more cowpeas, producing more beans, producing more bananas. So in the process, we are losing a lot of other aspects that I'll later talk to in terms of food sovereignty. So industrial agriculture, of course, as you're trying to increase production, there are issues around increasing inputs, chemical inputs, increasing use of hybrids, then promoting the genetically modified organisms agenda. All these are technologies that we have been proven to be detrimental, one, to nutrition of food, to farmers' livelihoods, to the quality of food itself in terms of the culture, aspects of food in terms of the nutritional value of food, but also impacting on people's health in some aspects. So of course, also industrial agriculture is looking at eliminating the majority of the food producers, who are the small-scale food producers, because it looks at how do we utilize land maximally. And what that means is that those that are producing on small pieces of land should go out of agriculture. Then let's have probably one large-scale farmer that can produce maize on 100 acres, on 200 acres, on even 50 acres, that's still large scale, and get these many other small scale farmers out of the practice. So of course, we know the value of small scale farmers to African agriculture, to food security, to food nutrition. We know what it means to livelihoods. We know what it means to communities being together. So we see that industrial agriculture has tentacles of so many other negative impacts that it's putting onto African agriculture, African culture, African society, the environment, and a number of other detrimental issues that are coming up that we can discuss as we move forward.
Absolutely. And you mentioned things like the production of bananas and beans. And am I correct in understanding that these are primary under the sort of industrial model? These items are actually being grown primarily for the purpose of export, not for feeding Africa, so that it's more of an economic-driven agriculture rather than one that's primarily about feeding the people and increasing healthy soil. Is that right?
Yeah, it's right. Because when you look at, for example, some of the reports like the FAO, the African Food and Nutrition Report 2019, I think 2020, you see the increased food exports that imports that Africa has. We're importing more than 70% of our food, and yet we are exporting most of what we produce. So, but when you look at who is exporting this food, it is not the small-scale farmers. It is the big, corporate companies that are now owning large chunks of land and producing for export. So it is not that we are increasing production and securing our own food security, but rather increasing production for export. So when you look at the kind of foods that are being promoted, for example, for mass production, like maize, and most of it is being exported. Even when you go beyond the crop farming, when you go, for example, to fisheries, the kind of fisheries that are now coming into Africa, large-scale fishing for export. So most of this increasing production is for purposes of export. And then what is happening in Africa is that now we are importing, food, which is a shame, considering that Africa has, over 60% of arable land. So it does not make sense that we are importing food and we're exporting the nutritious food that we are producing here.
It does seem like part of what you're doing and part of what OFSA is doing is really rethinking from the ground up what agriculture looks like in an African context. And if I understand correctly, your approach is sort of threefold. It includes changing policy, it includes changing mindsets and changing narratives in order to influence practices. So let's talk about changing narratives and mindsets. How is agroecology farming framing a different story or a different worldview from that of this modern industrial food system?
Yeah, what we are doing as AFSA, as the food sovereignty movement, yes, what we are advancing is agroecology. But I think what is very critical for the listeners to know is that we are not looking at food from a point of view of a commodity. That is what is happening now. Food is being commodified. Right. It's more of a commodity. But we are looking at food from the basic of what it is made for consumption. And then the other thing is looking at the people as at the center of food. So of course, the people who eat the food, those are the citizens. Sometimes they are called consumers, though consumers also has a sound to it that is really not right, So we are looking at the people as being at the center of food. So they determine what kind of food do we want to produce? What kind of food do we want to eat? Before we think about selling it and getting the money, it has to start with the people themselves. So now what we are trying to do right now, or what you see happening from mainly from the big corporate companies, is that there is a sale of narrative, because one, they have the finances, so they can influence the media. And the media, I mean the mainstream media, but also social media. If you look at the adverts, for example, if you just randomly came to Uganda or even Kenya or Tanzania and met a young person and asked them, what is your dream place to have a meal? probably they'll say one of the fast foods, the popular, fast food restaurants,
Really?
maybe from the US that are opening up here. Yes, because it has been portrayed, the narrative in the media portrays the fast foods, the imported foods that we buy in supermarkets as what is nutritious, as what is a status food, because then it defines your status, These are foods for the educated people, these are foods for the, rich people, the middle class. So the narrative is so strong in the media, and it is quite undermined that a lot of people do not realize how much impact it has. And even when you go to different spaces, where issues of food are being discussed, issues of land, climate, the narrative, for example, the narrative around land, that there is a lot of underutilized land in Africa, so we need to utilize it to grow food for export elsewhere, for other purposes. We need to rent it out, we need to invite investors. So there is a lot of narrative all over the entire agriculture sector. And this narrative is driving consumption habits, is driving public financing, because a lot of public financing, I know African governments have committed, I think in 2013, more recently, 2014, to put up to 10%, to the agriculture sector of public financing, which of course is very minimal, but that is the list that we have committed. But very few African governments have met that 10%. And even where they have met it, when you look at it critically, it's mainly administrative costs. But when you analyze the agriculture budgets, for example, I'll take an example of Uganda, where I'm based. Most of that funding is going to the so-called, industrial agriculture. That is what the funding is going for. So it is, and what influences that is the narrative that chemical fertilizers work better, the advertisements that go around, that hybrids are faster producing, they are cleaner, they are, so there is a lot of actions and policy directions and financing decisions that have made based on this strong narrative. We also see it systematically in global conferences, global conferences. We see this narrative pushed strongly in trade negotiations. We see this narrative pushed strongly by Western governments, by, for example, the US, by the EU. So these strong narratives are really deciding a lot in terms of the direction for African agriculture. So as AFSA, one of the things we are doing, one, is working around citizen mobilization. And this citizen mobilization involves a number of aspects. Of course, linking into that, we do, for example, we have in the last, since 2019, we launched a project to develop an African food policy. And what we are doing, we have gone so far in 24 African countries, held dialogues with citizens from the ground up to try and understand what kind of food policy do we want, what do we want to see in an ideal food policy for Africa. So we are getting citizen voices to be able to get to the decision makers at the national level, but also at the African Union, to set this as a kind of provisions. For example, we want in a food policy, this is an ideal food secure Africa. So to begin to change that narrative, to let Africans know that what we knew, what we're practicing, is not backward, it is not wrong, it is actually, what is the ideal. So we are doing quite a bit of that, but also we are directly engaging with the decision makers, with the policy makers, to create platforms for them to interact with citizens, to get a different narrative, to get the reality beyond the big offices and the conferences of what is happening with African agriculture, with the citizens, and be able to relate it as they work on different policies. But also, on the other hand, we are doing a bit of the practical work with food producers. For example, we have, since 5 years now, we've started a program on improving soil health. So this program involves practical training food producers and giving them practical tips, practical skills on how they can improve their soil through organic ways, through use of biological inputs. So we see that there is a bit of change beginning to happen among the few that we've been able to reach so far. Yeah.
What are some of the policies throughout Africa that you see impeding progress toward food sovereignty? And how can policy be leveraged to reshape food systems at the local level?
Yeah, when you look at the Africa's vision for agriculture, which is mainly encompassed in the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program, CAADP. When you analyze the entire CAADP, which has taken 10 years, then has been reviewed or is being reviewed. When you look at the entire vision of CAADP, which has Africa's agricultural vision, it's about getting Africa's agriculture to that level of industrialized agriculture. When you look at all the details of the the strategies, where we feel we should put strength in terms of advancing agriculture, it's moving towards industrial agriculture. Now CAADP goes down to the regional level in terms of regional economic communities or blocks, then it goes down to the national level for the countries to domesticate what is given as a provision for CAADP. So when you look at the entire continent in its entirety, even individual countries themselves, the entire vision is about industrialization of agriculture. So the challenge is that industrialization of agriculture is focusing on large-scale farming. Large-scale farming meaning that the 70% small-scale farmers, that have part of agriculture, that are feeding Africa, that have, been part of maintaining the system, caring for the soils, and feeding us for all these years, are going to be pushed out, of agriculture to cater for the large-scale farmers. And when you look at also part of our visions is to increase investment in agriculture. Now, the kind of investments that we are attracting in Africa, the kind of investments that we are talking about, are foreign investments. Even when you look at our investment agreements, our investment laws, they are really catering for foreign investments, foreign investors. There are concessions for them. For example, giving them land, access to cheap land or free land at that, because they're coming to, industrialize and develop our agricultural sector. So give them free land. But what is happening, for example, I can give you an example of Uganda where I am and I can speak very comfortably. What is happening where these investors are getting land, then it gets to, they are planting sugarcane, for example, no one is eating sugarcane for daily meal. So they are planting.
Our children are, I think. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. And so they are planting sugarcane, they are planting, foreign tree species that are not even good for the soil. Maybe they're doing a bit of maize, for export. So there is, ultimately, it is not even, the policies are favoring that kind of investment. They are favoring industrial agriculture, but even the concessions that are given are not in any way benefiting, benefiting Africans. So the CAADP is expected to end, I think, in about 3 or 4 years before it is, the goals are reviewed and all that. But we've not seen any results, We've not seen any results for Africa. We have not, because there's a lot of gaps there. Africans, many of them didn't participate in the process of developing this policy. They do not understand it. there is no finance for it at that, there's no financing for it. So when you look at our agricultural policy, honestly, it is more out there than in here for Africans, There is less appreciation or focus inwardly for what it means for Africans, what the Africans want. It is more outward looking. How do we attract foreign investment? How do we attract foreign funding for African agriculture? And of course, funding comes with strings attached. It comes with bringing my funding for this specific project. I'm bringing my funding for this specific program. And to bring my funding, I need this amount of land. And, so it is our agricultural policy, honestly, is looking outward and not inward. That is why AFSA in 2018 made the resolution that we need to come up with an African food policy. And we launched that process in 2019. It has been going on 2019, 2020, and also this year, 2021 until 2023. And what I am happy to also share with you is that the African Union has come on board. We are partnering with them. Yes, so we are collaborating with them. We recently had an experts meeting at the African Union a few weeks back, but that is after we've had so many processes at the country level, dialogues, research, review of policies. So now we are working together, the African Union, we have agreed to collaborate on this process and ultimately come up with a food policy. The other issue that also drove us to come up with the African food policy is the realization of the incoherence within agricultural policy across the continent. So you will find there is, for example, you could look at the climate change policy, and it's talking about nature-based solutions and the need to conserve the environment. Then you look at the agricultural sector investment plan, and it's talking about, we need to industrialize, we need to increase use of chemical fertilizers, chemical inputs. So there is a lot of incoherence, and it comes from the national level to up to the continental level. So that realization of that incoherence is also another reason as to why AFSA has advanced that process to develop an African food policy. And like I mentioned, I'm glad to note that the African Union has come on board, and we are working together on that specific intervention or initiative. Yeah.
That is exciting news. Thank you for sharing that. Something that you were saying also made me remember that so agroecology, it effectively combines indigenous knowledge with sort of the cutting edge of science, right? So it's sort of combining the past with the future, so to speak. And when policies and across Africa for agriculture policies, when they are effectively abandoning that indigenous knowledge, it seems like it's also an abandonment of indigenous culture in a way. I'm curious if you could speak to the implications of, well, I'll give you some options. What is the impact of this sort of industrial policies on indigenous culture throughout Africa? And then if you also want to say a little bit about some examples of what this combining of indigenous knowledge with cutting edge science looks like in practice.
Yeah, it is, well, if I can speak about the impact, probably I'll touch on both through as I respond. If I speak about the impact of the push for industrial agriculture, the impact on indigenous knowledge. One, I think when you analyze, food and agriculture in the, if I may use the word, typical or African, understanding or setting, it is, food it's beyond, food and agriculture is beyond, like I shared before, it's beyond just the product, that comes out of food. There are so many other complexities around food. It is a web. By the time you get to what you define as food, there are so many issues that go on there. For example, just the process of food production. There are cultural issues around who selects the seeds. There are seeds that are really kept in the custody of women. There are seeds where men are the ones that are responsible for them. There are also specific seeds where children are the ones that are, are responsible for them. Then there are cultural issues around that. There are cultural issues around production of food, around preparation of food, around specific foods. There are so many cultural issues that are attached. There are foods that have different sexes. This is male, this is female. There are foods that are prepared for weddings. There are foods that are prepared for funerals. There are foods that are prepared for, traditional wedding ceremonies. There are foods that are prepared at a birth of a child, a male child, a female child. So there is a lot of cultural issues, a lot of knowledge around food. And of course, it could be taken lightly that these are just culture issues, but there are also other benefits that there are things through, issues of nutrition. For example, how is this food prepared in a way that, you don't lose the nutritional value? How do you prepare it? Do you add little water? Do you add more water? Do you put salt? Don't you put, there is a lot of information there in that we are losing. So if you come and, for example, say we should have one variety of bananas, promoted when you have 40 varieties with different functions, with different cultural attachments, then you're losing a lot of knowledge. You're losing a lot of, cultural attachments, with the food, because each food has a different attachment to it, a different, respect to it. So there is a lot of knowledge that is lost therein. But also in terms of, to speak about what we call the day-to-day agricultural problems, issues of pests. There is a reason as to why agriculture was practiced the way it was, to control pests, to maintain the soil, and all that is indigenous knowledge. Because it's not documented in a scientific journal, then it is not recognized. It's not recognized because no one talks about it. So if I have a work preserving the soil that I have not written down, but I've been managing and practicing, then it can't be compared to, the chemical fertilizers that have all these percentages written on the tins, that is this percentage, and you get this percentage of output, then so of course there is all that we are losing. Along the way. Sorry, I might have lost one of the questions, but.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah. That's wonderful. This has been super helpful so far, and I want to free us up to dream a little bit. And let's imagine a world, let's say the year 2030, not too far away, but we may only have a decade to make a difference. So let's imagine that you have successfully influenced policies and implemented solutions for food sovereignty in Africa. Congratulations, by the way. 2030, food sovereignty in Africa. Great work. What does it look like? How is food grown? How is it distributed? Who owns the farmland? Who works on it? How do you manage seeds? Describe this future for me.
Well, 2030 would be a good, it would be a good year. It's just a few years, 9 years, I guess. I think for me, I'll go back to one of the first things I mentioned. For me, food is about the people. It's about the people, of course, the people in the sense that the people who consume it, the people who produce it. So I think one of the ideal situations I would see is that food it's a source of dignity, to people. The people who consume it, who produce it, have their dignity in the process of consuming it, in the process of producing it. And the dignity, I mean, one, they have the right to make decisions on the kind of food they want to eat. So it wouldn't be a situation where we see food security has been achieved, for example, through food aid, you know. I don't feel that is dignified enough, or that food security has been achieved by giving people food that they might not desire, but they need just to stay alive, you know. So I would see a situation where people have access to the food they need in terms of nutrition, in terms of their own cultural attachments. For example, in Uganda, we have, I think also in a few other countries, we have clans. So I have a clan, and the food, the animal that is my clan, I do not eat that animal. So I do not eat it. I should not, you know, be in any way put in a situation where I have to eat it. So I need to be able to make that decision to what I eat, what I don't eat. Also, that dignity I'm talking about is, you know, if there is, I want to give an example. I could give an example. For example, in Uganda, when the fishermen, including the fisherwomen, when they do the fishing, they sell off the fillet for export. So what stays at home for consumption or for the fishermen are the bones, practically the bones and the tail and the head. So we sell off, and ironically, what stays is what is called fillet, but the fillet is exported. So you find that the fishermen who actually go to the lake are consuming, you know, the leftovers of the fish, because ultimately it's just about, it is being made about the money. So we need that kind of dignity. But also what I would want to see ideally is the markets, you know, is the markets. The development, I would love to see local markets developed. Local markets where the food producers themselves can be able to sell what is an excess, for them to be able to, you know, to have some money in their pockets. Because what we see now is that traders, you know, that have export companies will go into the gardens and buy off at very cheap prices, very low prices, you know, obscene prices. They'll buy off food or sometimes gardens, and the farmers will still stay poor. So you will have no money to buy food. You'll also have sold off that food because you want to get food. You want to get money to, you know, access other services, health, education, and the little you're left with will not buy the kind of balanced, you know, diet you need. So of course, I would love to see where there are local markets developed, where there are fair trade agreements, you know. Probably that will not be 2030, but fair trade agreements, which would mean that the exports, it's not just about exporting raw materials and importing, you know, or not importing, and, you know, in another way, having food dumped into Africa. Yeah. So I'd love to see, you know, fair trade agreements if they can happen. And I think the other realization, and I think for me that is possible. Unfortunately, it's something that we've seen in this COVID-19 with the pandemic, because it has forced many of our countries to look inwards, you know, where there was a time where borders were closed, and, you know, so local markets, ironically, they were seemingly booming, because now we had to buy food locally. You couldn't go to the restaurant, to the supermarkets. You had to buy food at the market, which is 50 or 100 meters away from you. So we saw a boost of that. And APSA did a research in about 18 African countries, just to understand how the impact of COVID on food and agriculture. And that is one of the surprising findings that we got, that, you know, local markets now were seemingly, you know, given a boost, because now we're not importing food, we are not moving, so we are forced to really boost these local markets, and we saw that the importance of local markets. I think maybe the last thing I could also talk about is, or the second, that's the finance, I would love to see financing going to agroecology, because we all know the benefits of agroecology. It's only that the money that is coming, mainly from the Western governments to fund our budgets, it's not a priority. It's not a priority. They're funding industrial-driven agriculture. So if agroecology is, right now we are doing there's a lot of agroecology going on. Farmers are doing a lot of work with very little financing. So just imagine if we just had a boost, to support research on agroecology, to support local markets. I think we'd really have an ideal situation for food security and agriculture in Africa.
That's wonderful. Yeah, the silver lining of COVID is an interesting one, where you see those benefits. And talking about food sovereignty, I'd hate to think that Western governments like the United States are using food aid as a, I don't know, basically, well, as Vandana Shiva has said, using food as a weapon, and keeping African countries dependent on external imports for their basic needs. I'd hate to think that that's the case, but it's hard to not see that writing on the wall. I know we're coming up on our time here. I did want to talk about a few more things, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So you just laid out this sort of dream of your vision for what food sovereignty would look like in Africa. And I'm curious, can you name some of the major obstacles in realizing that vision of food sovereignty in Africa? And then what are some of the key leverage points for change?
I guess some of the obstacles have, in one or the other, hinted on them, in terms of course, the narrative, which is the biggest challenge we have, because it touches on so many other aspects. I've of course talked about the issues of the finance, which is also a huge obstacle. There's a lot of finance that is going to, to industrial agricultural projects, programs like Agra, and less finance going to agroecology. If you compare the funding that is happening, that is going to agroecology focused initiatives and what is going to industrial agriculture, I don't think it's even comparable, because industrial agriculture has government funding, it has funding of foundations and corporations, big foundations and corporations. So of course that is a huge obstacle. I think also the other obstacle that in a way also relates to what I've talked about is the influence, the Western influence, the external influence that we have in our policies. Because of course, there is the finance that is dangled. There's a lot of external influence in how policies are being made on the African continent. When you look at, for example, policies to do with plant variety protection, when you look at the seed harmonization laws that are happening within Africa, you look at funders, from the EU, for example, that are coming in to support such initiatives. So there's a lot of external influence that is hindering the advancement of food sovereignty, because then they promote the interests of corporations from the West. But in terms of I think what we can leverage on right now, for me, I feel it still goes back to the people. One, we have, I believe now, a growing food sovereignty movement. I think on the continent, Africa, but also the movement is growing even beyond. In India, for example, there's a growing movement for food sovereignty. And we are also getting a bit of support from other continents. I mean, for example, from the US, there are few groups that are coming in to advance this agenda. So for me, I feel ultimately changing changing this train, you know, that seems to be on one track will only happen if the people come together and demand, you know, and demand from their governments. Because I do not, we could do all the research, we could write all the documents, we could put out all the letters, but ultimately the people themselves have to have a voice, you know, to use these platforms to come up and tell their governments that this is what we want. This is the food sovereignty we want. So for me, that is the biggest point of leverage that we'll have. The other is around if funders can, you know, if funders that are putting most of their monies to the industrial agriculture can divert some of that funding to agroecology, because agroecology probably doesn't need if we had the big monies that have been put, for example, into agro,
right.
I think we'd be very far with advancing, you know, agroecology. So we need the financing that is not something that I can hide, because there is research that also happens within agroecology. We need centers, training centers to come up, for example, to be able to train food producers on soil management, on you know, a number of other agroecological practices. So we need financing to happen. We need financing to move people around, to move people together, to be able to just create platforms to share this information and build the movement. Yeah.
Wonderful. You've already started to touch on my last question here, but the challenges that we're talking about in order to achieve food sovereignty in Africa, they're really complex, it's widespread challenges, yet there are emerging opportunities and new developments. And in the midst of all of this, I wonder, what gives you hope?
Yeah, I think what gives me hope is one, just that there is a lot on the African continent. There is a lot on the African continent that can leverage in terms of resources. For example, we have the land, you know, to produce the foods that we desire to produce. We have a young population. We have a young population that one can invent, do a lot of innovations with the right resources, but also provides the, you know, right source of labor. We have the food, we have the diversity. We still have a lot of diversity of foods, you know, in terms of, for example, different varieties. We still have a lot of that on the continent. We have, of course, I've talked about the natural resources, the biodiversity, the young people that on the continent, the growing movement, you know, of people that are beginning to advocate and appreciate why we need agroecology and joining the food sovereignty movement. But of course, also the positive changes that we begin to see, for example, the initiative that we've collaborated on in the African Union. It gives hope that we might at some point, you know, move to the direction that we want to move. But also the realization now with this pandemic that, you know, we need to have a more inward-looking strategy to deal with the challenges of food security, I think is beginning to open up a bit of doors for discussion between governments and their citizens. But also another issue I could talk about is around, I think, the growing research and realization of the impacts and the harms of industrial agriculture, issues around using chemical inputs, you know, the impact on air quality, water quality, soil health, issues around diseases, biodiversity destruction. There's a lot of research that is coming out, scientific research, which is mostly appreciated, that is coming out, you know, to show that the negative impacts of industrial agriculture. So even with all the funding that is going into industrial agriculture, we do not see a lot of, we don't see the positive results that are coming out. So this realization of their impact, the growing realization, I think it gives me hope that it is going on, it's industrial agriculture is on a downward curve in terms of what they can put out there as, as positive impacts. So it gives me hope that at some point we'll come to a realization and an agreement that it has failed, it cannot feed Africa, and we need to go back to agroecology ultimately.
Yeah, the new story, the story is changing, which is exciting. There's momentum there. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we conclude? Anything else?
Well, I feel like I don't know what else I could add, but maybe what I can still tackle is around the narrative. I talked quite a bit about the narrative on industrial agriculture, but there's a lot of thinking that when you talk about agroecology, then you talk about just small scale traditional agriculture. So maybe my parting point would be just to let our listeners know that agroecology is beyond that. It's not just the small scale farmers, because I've talked about it. Agroecology can be practiced on a large scale. So it is not either agroecology or increasing production. No, it can be both. You can still produce massively, but through agroecology. But also the other issue, I think for me, that I need to emphasize is that we need to look at food starting from the people. The people have to be at the center of any discussion of food. And so it has to do with the dignity of the people, it has to do with their livelihoods, it has to do with our cultures, it has to do with the safety in terms of health safety, but also the, security, the food security, in terms of, so my point is that everything should start with the people. It shouldn't start with, export, markets, GDP, calculations, and all that. It starts with the people. How happy are they? How are they, how is our agenda as human beings being promoted in terms of looking at food? Yeah.
Fantastic. You've heard it here, folks. This is how to feed Africa, and this is how to feed the world, agroecology as this alternative paradigm. Bridget, this has been a wonderful conversation. I'm continually amazed by the opportunity to connect with brilliant leaders and activists like yourself from around the world, to be sitting in my garage in my home in Salem, Oregon, and then connect with you all the way over in Uganda. It's just so much fun. And thank you for taking the time. For those who are listening who want to learn more about Bridget and the work of AFSA, please check out the website, afsaafrica.org. That's AFSA Africa, FRICA.org. And please just consider supporting their amazing work, because it's going to take all of us working together to change the world.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you for having me. Let's all go agroecology.